All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a story that's been pieced together from forgotten archives and, these whispered testimonies. This whole investigation, it doesn't start with some monster or a grand conspiracy. No, it all begins with a really simple, almost mundane architectural puzzle.
So here's the question that kicked this whole thing off. Why on earth would you build a hospital with 14-foot ceilings? I mean, we're talking about a whole series of hospitals in 19th century Eastern Europe, all built with these dimensions that just, well, they feel impossible for the time. It just doesn't make any sense. So this is what we're calling the architectural anomaly. Now, the official story, the one they gave everyone, was that the high ceilings were all about better air circulation, right? To fight off what they called miasma theory, this old idea that disease was spread by bad air. But, when you start looking at the bigger picture, that answer just doesn't hold up.
And look, we're not just talking about rooms that are a little bigger than average. These places were built on a scale that completely defied why they were supposed to be there in the first place. You've got 14-foot ceilings, 10-foot doorways that a normal person couldn't even reach the top of, and corridors so wide you could literally drive a carriage down them. This wasn't an accident. This was absolutely deliberate.
And this is where it gets really interesting. Because when you actually map out where these 23 hospitals are located, well, they don't just pop up randomly. No way. They form a corridor, a route. It's so clear these weren't just isolated buildings. They were part of a network, a purpose-built path designed for someone or something that was expected to travel along.
Okay, so that brings us to the next piece of the puzzle, the patient in Tallinn. The investigation really started to focus on this one specific facility in Tallinn, Estonia. And it's here that a single document was found that took this from a kind of, historical curiosity into a genuine, full-blown mystery.
So let's set the scene. It's January 1897. And this is the moment everything changes. Because a requisition form gets filed at the Tallinn Medical Society. A form for a very, very special patient.
Okay, so let's look at this requisition. A bed frame of extended dimension, reinforced supports. I mean, right away that tells you they're expecting a very large patient. But it's that last item that'll give you chills, acoustic dampening. Think about that. They weren't worried about noise getting in, they were terrified of what might be heard getting out.
So you have to ask yourself, what were they so afraid of hearing? The bottom line is this. This was never, ever about patient comfort. It was about containment. It was all about controlling the sounds coming from inside that room.
And the timeline here is it's stark. And frankly, it's terrifying. Look at this. The patient arrives on January 9th. Over the next 17 days, he tells his story to the doctors. Then, on January 26th, he dies. The very next morning, the entire medical society, these men of science, they make the absolutely insane decision to destroy all of their own research. They burned every single page of notes.
So now we have this trail of whispers. With all the official records literally turned to ash, the only way to figure out what happened was to piece it together from fragments, right? These little hidden sources that somehow managed to survive.
And here's one of those pieces. A quote from Helena Tam, who was the granddaughter of a nurse who was actually there in 1897. She said, "He filled the room just by lying there. When he spoke, you could feel it in your chest." I mean, this account, passed down to her family, it gives you this really visceral sense of his presence. This wasn't just some tall guy. He was a force of nature. His voice wasn't just loud, it was so deep it vibrated in your bones.
And then we have this, a number, a hard fact, 8 feet, 7 inches. This comes from a private letter that was recovered, written by the head doctor, Dr. Victor Cross, to his wife. Can you imagine? 8'7".
But here's the really crucial medical detail from that very same letter. Dr. Krauss, and remember, this guy was an expert in anatomy. He makes it absolutely clear this was not a case of gigantism, not acromegaly, none of the conditions we know about. No, by all accounts, this patient was perfectly proportioned. His organs were normal. He was, and this is Krauss's own words, simply a human being of impossible scale.
All right, so this is where the story goes from a single hidden patient to something much, much bigger, something way more sinister. We're talking about a systematic erasure. The investigation started to uncover evidence of a coordinated international effort to wipe away any proof that people like him had ever even existed.
And that brings us to something called Protocol 7. This phrase shows up exactly one time, buried in a classified file about how to dispose of research subjects. The implication is terrifying.
It suggests that this patient's remains were considered way too dangerous or maybe just too revealing to be given a normal burial. It just appears once in the record, this Protocol 7, and then, poof, it's gone.
Now look at this data. This discrepancy is it's stunning. On the one hand, you have the official records from the Russian Empire, and they show this dramatic, totally unexplained drop in documented cases of giantism. But then you look at unofficial accounts, like local church records and things, and they stay consistent, right up until they suddenly stop in 1897. What does that tell you? It tells you they weren't running out of giants, they were just stopping the paperwork. The cover-up was in full swing.
And this wasn't just a Russian thing either. We're talking about international silencing. Any doctor anywhere in Europe who got a little too close to the truth was systematically shut down. In Berlin, a Dr. Mueller is told his subject did not exist, and then poof, his files disappear. In Vienna, a Dr. Lehmann writes about the case, and the very next page is literally cut out of his diary with a razor. And then in Prague, a doctor starts noticing that these patients are being collected and sent to Russia, and then he gets a little visit telling him to stop asking questions.
So why? Why go to all this trouble? The reason for this massive cover-up finally starts to become clear, thanks to the testimony of a night watchman's grandson and a physician's daughter. It turns out it was never really about the giant's body. It was about his final words, his final warning.
And according to what was passed down, he didn't speak with anger. It was more like this profound grief. He said, "We built this world, and now you've forgotten us completely." He was mourning a history that was lost, a world that his people had apparently built only to be totally erased by us, the people who came after.
But this was the real core of his warning. When the last of us is gone, something very old will begin to wake. He claimed his people weren't rulers or kings, they were anchors. Their very presence, their physical mass on the planet, was what held something much, much older in a state of slumber, and his death, as the last of his kind, would break that cosmic balance.
So if he was so important, where did his body go? The trail doesn't just go cold at his deathbed. It points to one final, incredibly chilling location: a sleeper in the ice.
So let's look at the clues for his final resting place. Multiple accounts say his body was transported under heavy guard to the frozen north of Russia. Then, a 1934 Soviet survey mentions a mysterious Storage Facility 7 right there in the Kola Peninsula. And the final piece? A former Soviet archivist who remembers seeing a file on that facility, and in the margin a handwritten note that just said, "The sleeper must not be disturbed." You see, he wasn't buried, he was stored, put away for a reason, with a very clear warning.
So what if the sleeper dreams of waking? It's been 127 years, the last giant's gone, and that warning he gave still echoes out from those burned pages and classified files. The doctors who heard him, they chose to erase everything, hoping to bury a truth they just couldn't handle. And so the only question that really matters now is the one he left for us to answer.